All right, episode 3, here it is. Uh, first two were obviously about uh, current events and war and politics and all that. I'm probably going to be focused on that, but I want to do this just with things that I'm interested in. It's looking more to do it as like a Joe Rogan type of thing, to where whatever interests me that day is what I want to speak about. Now, of course, pressing issues will, take priority, but what I want to talk about is what I'm going to talk about that day. So today, I touched on it for second last episode, but my dog Mago. Everybody always asks, where's that name come from? What does that mean? This and that. So I thought I'd go over brief history of the Second Punic War in particular, but the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage. So Carthage was a Phoenician colony. It was on the northern tip of Tunisia, right off the coast of Sicily. It's kind of like right, you have Italy, and you have Sicily, and then right at the tip, you have a little horn coming off of Africa, which is Tunisia and where Carthage was. And you know what? They got along great for the first few hundred years after Rome's founding. They were actually older than Rome. They were an extremely mercantile city. They didn't have a standing army or anything like that. They needed to go to war. They paid mercenaries to do it because they just traded with everybody. There's records that show that they even made it up to Britain way before Julius Caesar ever made his journey there and an invasion. They went down to the Canary Islands, even. Like, they were Phoenicians, so they were very seafaring people, and they just traded, and that's what they were about. So, eventually, after a few hundred years, Rome and Carthage came to a head over a city in Sicily. There was a group of mercenaries called the Mamertines who had taken over a city, and then, long story short, they called both Rome and Carthage for help. And both of them basically raced to get there because they both wanted a foothold in Sicily. Sicily is almost like a toll booth in the Mediterranean. If you want to go from the western to the eastern side, you're going to have to go around Sicily. And that means ships will have to stop in your ports and will have to pay you. And so they both wanted a foothold there. That eventually led to the First Punic War, where Rome actually, that's just kind of what made Rome the greatest empire, was that they could take whatever you did, make it their own. And eventually, they didn't have a navy even. They eventually built a navy. One of the Carthaginian, it's called a quinreme. So it was 5 rows of oars. Quinreme, washed ashore on Italy. They deconstructed it and rebuilt it to learn how to make it, and built their own navies. But that still leaves an issue of, that rowing those ships requires muscles that are built up over a lifetime. Learning how to navigate, how to steer, it takes a long time to learn. You're not just going to step on a ship and just do it, especially those kinds of ships. So that meant that they were still at a severe disadvantage in naval battles. Back then, naval battles were all about maneuvering, positioning, and basically getting to the point where the tip of your ship had a bronze beak, and you would just try to ram the other ship and sink it. Romans did not have that skill to do that. So what they did do was come up with a great invention. It's called a corvus. And all it was just a little drawbridge, and it had a spike right at the tip. So they would just get close to those Carthaginian ships, drop it, and it would spike. And you know what? As much of a disadvantage they had maneuvering in the water, the Romans had that same advantage over the Carthaginians in hand-to-hand battles. In physical combat, Carthaginians could not match Romans. There were mercenary armies, and Romans drilled and Romans trained. They had, a real army. So eventually, this First Punic War ends with a ceasefire, and Carthage has to give up all of its colonies in Sicily, in Sardinia, a few others throughout. And, it's kind of an uneasy peace, but that's the way it went. Fast forward to the Second Punic War. There was a general in the first. His name was Hamilcar Barca, and he was actually undefeated. They had to drag him out of the mountains of Sicily at the end of the war because he was up there, held up with his soldiers, just fighting off the Romans there. But they eventually called him back, and they sent him to their colony in Spain. And he ran the colony there, and they did well. He was fighting the tribal people, the Iberians and the Celts there. They had also Celtiberians, which is kind of like a combination of the two peoples. And he had his sons. Now he had Hannibal, he had Hasdrubal, and he had Mago. And Hannibal was, basically his father's son. He was brought up to hate Rome to his core. He actually had Hannibal swear on an altar of Baal, which was one of their gods. He was also a Canaanite god and a Phoenician god. That's where that religion comes from. But he had to swear on an altar of Baal that he will, hate the Romans and he'll bring the Romans down. Eventually, Hamilcar wound up being killed in battle against some of these tribes. And Hannibal kind of takes his father's role. The Carthaginian, it's not the Senate. It's kind of like a body, governing body. They had instated him that they had elected to put him in his father's role. His brother-in-law too, which was also named Hasdrubal. They don't have many names in Carthage, and then eventually, it built up an army, and this army was ferocious. Just from you get hardened in battle. It's like steel, it gets sharpened the more and more you do it. And this army was formidable. And he got some elephants, some war elephants sent over, and he set up a stage to go bring the war to Rome. And so that started with a city called Saguntum, which is kind of on the border of France and Spain. And he laid it to siege. They called their Roman. They were protected. They had like a protection guarantee from Rome. And they called their Roman allies, and then Rome sent people down to Carthage, like, hey, tell him to stop. You're not the ones that are doing this. Otherwise, it's going to be a war, this and that. The Carthaginians threw them out. And ultimately, Hannibal broke through Saguntum, razed that city to the ground. That was kind of like the rule in ancient warfare. Like, once we surround your city and get to your city, if you surrender, then we'll let you live. We may take your stuff and, send you away. But that is, once the siege engines, the ladders touch the walls, all bets are off. It's no matter what there's a Latin term. It's called vae victis. It means woe to the vanquished, which just you are put through whatever we say. You'll deal with whatever we want to make you deal with, and that's it. So that's what he did with Saguntum. And, a Roman force did kind of come to try to aid them, but they were a little too late. And basically, Hannibal took his troops north up around the Alps of France and Switzerland today. And there he actually, he was sending people to all the tribes, all the people that he encountered, because nobody liked Rome. But some of them were friendly, some of them joined, others did not. And he fought a lot of those tribals there, and it actually, a few of them, he beat them in battle, and then said, "All right, well, now you got to join me," and they went. And Romans were stationing people at all the passes, all these different areas where you can kind of get through without having to go over the Alps, because nobody crossed the Alps. That's just, it was like the Atlantic. You don't cross that. It's impossible. Except Hannibal. There's a quote attributed to him. Again, with ancient history, you kind of just, you don't have anything else to go on besides the stories. So you just have to believe the stories, where he says, "I will either find a way or make one." And he made one. He took all of his Carthaginian, African troops. There was, he had the Numidians, who were kind of like mid-Africa, like Libya, and all the way over to like Morocco. They were called the Numidians. They were actually the best cavalry at the time, pretty much. I mean, you'll probably have some Central Asian horsemen and stuff like that, but as far as the Western Mediterranean world, the Numidian cavalry was top of its class. So he took his Carthaginians, his Numidian allies, took the Celts and the Gauls that he had join him, and they went over the Alps. And he actually lost all of his elephants just marching over those Alps, marching over those mountains. There's small little passes that are cliff sides, this and that. They were starving, freezing. Everything was, crossing a mountain range for modern times. Just think about that. And they eventually do cross. Romans were stunned, couldn't believe it. But they had scouts that were kind of going through the mountains, and they met him at the bottom, at the river Trebia, it's called. It's at northern Italy. And, they were ready for battle. There always just seemed to be kind of a advantage that Hannibal would exploit. Like, they were so worried about this force that had just come out of these mountains. It was like almost like seeing a ghost, that none of them could relax. None of the Romans could relax. They were up all night. They were on watch. They were waiting, trying to make sure that they didn't slip away, the Carthaginian army. Like, they just did not have a good night. And Hannibal's troops couldn't wait to sleep on some soft ground. And he had all of his scouts gather up food. They had a nice big breakfast very early in the morning. And the Romans didn't. So Hannibal had started the attack of battle. And apparently there was some sleet and rain that day that was going into the Romans' face and, at the backs of Hannibal's troops. And he routed that whole army. He actually killed one man named Scipio. There was the Roman names. There was the Scipio family, and he killed one of them, who was the general. And as he went, all right, so that's it. The battle's over. It's that's how ancient battles worked. There was big battles, and then maybe little skirmishes, harassing here and there, but you just went until the next big battle, And so Hannibal marched down into Italy. He went through some swamplands that actually he got, while he was riding his elephant, supposedly he got stung in the eye by a mosquito, which got infected, and he lost an eye there. But still, he marched on and he got to Lake Traciny. And, there was a small little pathway along part of the lake. And I believe it was springtime. So, it was still cold in the morning and at night and then warm up. And that caused fog to form on the lake and around it. And again, it's one of those things that Hannibal used to his advantages. So he hid his troops on the other side of the ridge, like along this pathway. There was, trees and forests and bushes, whatever. And he hid his troops on the other side of that. And he put, it almost looked like the rear of his marching army. So when you march, you set in a certain way, and usually you have your army, and then you'll have your baggage train with all your supplies, all your food, or this and that, and then you'll have a rear guard, which is there to stop anybody from coming and taking that from you. So he set up his baggage train and his rear guard to start going through this trail along the river, so that the Roman army that was now coming to start and have another battle, that they would see that and pursue. Because if you can hit the rear with a full army, get the baggage train, even if you just do just that, that's crippling to an ancient army. So Romans are eager for glory. That's also another huge part of why they were so great, is because they always wanted to have the glory, have the honor. So they pursued that baggage train, which they thought was the rear of the army that were going to wipe out Hannibal. And now, again, we talked about the fog. The fog had rolled off the river at this point and into those bushes and those trees and concealed his army completely. So right when, basically the middle of the Roman column was at the side of the Carthaginians that were hidden, they came screaming out of those trees, out of those bushes, and out of the fog, again, like ghosts, and just wiped out this Roman army. It wasn't even a battle. It was just a slaughter. Romans drowned running into the river to try to get away from it. It was just, Hannibal is still studied to this day for these reasons. It's that he picked his battles. When he chose the battlefield, it was this, he would pick every natural advantage, every time advantage, everything. He would plan it so well that it wouldn't even be a battle. And then, as he went through after that, Rome had actually elected a dictator. His name was Fabian. And he pursued what's even still to this day known as the Fabian Strategy. Basically, Hannibal just had what he had there. Carthage wasn't sending him supplies. He didn't have a whole baggage train because couldn't do that through the Alps and through those tribal people. They're unreliable. So he had to live off the land. He had to hope that these towns and cities throughout Italy that had pledged to, in the past and were conquered by Rome or, made alliances with Rome, he hoped that they would switch sides. And that was basically his strategy. He knew he couldn't conquer Rome itself, but if you could isolate it from all of its neighboring allies and cities and stuff, then you can just kind of strangle it. So as he went through Italy, Fabian just sent nothing but little harassing forces. They would kill his foragers, kill his scouts, every town that he went to that would kind of turn on Rome a little bit, he would send Roman diplomats there and they would bribe them, or they would do this, they would do that. Just, it gave Hannibal no victory outside of battle. It's just like he was kind of putting out little fires everywhere all over Italy. And this went on for years. But talking about that honor thing with Rome, Romans couldn't stand it. It drove them crazy to just not fight. This man is on our peninsula. He's ravaging this. He's doing this. We have to get him off. And Fabian said, no, you don't fight him. Just let him basically starve slowly. Well, the dictatorship is only for a certain period of time, and that term came to an end. And they elected two new consuls who raised the largest army I believe Rome ever fielded up until that point. And kind of funny with the Roman system. So when two consuls would lead a Roman army, it was funny how their system worked. They would have alternating days. So you had one consul named Paulus and one consul named Varro. And Paulus, he actually didn't mind the Fabian strategy. He he knew that Hannibal was a great general. These people did know of each other. It's not like, oh, it's just some mystery person. And Hannibal had plenty of intel on those Roman consuls, Paulus and Varro. Varro was an honor hound. He couldn't believe that they were letting it happen, and he wanted to beat Hannibal so that he could march him back to Rome, have a triumph, which is the greatest honor that anybody could have in Rome at that point. To be given a triumph, which is just basically a parade through Rome. And so that's all he saw. That's all he thought about. So Hannibal, evaded them for a while and got to a place where he chose. It's called Cannae or Canny, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And he waited until it was Varro's day of command. And he went out and he, formed up for battle, which, that's kind of just how you did it. You say, all right, I want to fight. So you form up your lines and this and that, and you wait for the other one. So Varro couldn't wait to do it, But the way Hannibal did it was just so genius. It's still studied today. I believe, I could be wrong. There could be another one, but it was the first, and it could be the only triple envelopment ever performed on the battlefield. And what that means is that he, double envelopment means like you get him like both sides. Like, no, he got him from three sides and just closed the Roman army in. So what he did was he had his strong Carthaginian troops, the hardened veterans on the ends of his lines. And he put the tribal people, the mercenaries and stuff in the middle. Usually the middle is your strongest point because you don't want your line to break in half, because if it snaps in half, then now half your army is fighting, one whole army. So he put his weakest troops in the middle, his strongest troops on the side at the end, and he put the cavalry outside of that. That's a normal tactic. But he had the Numidian cavalry. So the tribal people and everybody were kind of protesting, like, we're going to go up against the best troops, where, they didn't have the same equipment, this and that. But Hannibal said, no, you were not there to die. And to prove that, he was the tip of the spear. He was right in the middle with them. And what he did was he arranged his army not in a straight line. He did it bowed outward towards the Romans. So it was kind of like, a round semicircle. Because he knew they were the weakest troops. So anyway, so he kind of marched up a little bit and then let the Romans come in. And then as the Roman center hit that weak point, the army gets slowly pushed back. We think of battle like we see in the movies, this and that. We're just dying. The majority of deaths didn't occur mid-battle like that. Like, yes, of course, there were some, but most of them came as the army flees. Like, once the formation and every army is broken and routing, then it's the pursuit that kills the most people, not battle itself. So, but what does happen is that the lines start to bend. So that center, the semicircle starts to slowly flex this way. But Now you got to remember, at the ends of the Roman formation are their weaker troops going against the strong Carthaginian troops. So as it bent in, the Carthaginians were right there on the side, and it almost like cut off the Roman army from itself. So at that point, he had some reservists in the back to come, shore up the middle of the line to stop them from being pushed back any further. And those sides then turned inward and closed in on those Roman troops that were now kind of in like a bag almost. And going back to the Numidians now, is the Numidians, like I said, they were the gold standard of cavalry. Romans barely had a cavalry of their own for hundreds of years after, even. So they chased off the Roman cavalry very quickly and, pursued them for a while till they were sure they were gone. They weren't going to come back. And so they wheeled back around and closed the top of that bag. So now you had 70,000 Romans trapped in between this trap. I mean, they were closed in. The cavalry closed the lid on it. So now the numbers didn't matter. I also forgot to mention in the beginning, it was about 30,000 to 75,000 Romans. 30,000 Carthaginians were outnumbered by double. But now Hannibal had taken that advantage away, because those troops in that middle can't do anything. The only troops that matter are the ones that are outside facing this closing circle on them. And that's what it did. It closed very slowly around them. So the troops in the middle just literally had to stand, wait to die. That was their only option. They were supposedly closed in so tight that they couldn't even raise their sword arms. There's other accounts from historians where they found soldiers in the middle that had just dug holes and buried their heads in it, because it's better to suffocate themselves than stand there and wait for them to slowly come and kill them. I don't know if I believe that 100%, but like I said earlier, all you have is stories, so you kind of have to believe everything. I remember watching a show on the History Channel years ago. It was called Battles BC, and they talked about this one battle. And there's a historian. I actually have a few of his books. His name, I can't remember right now, but he has a funny part to it. Right at that point in the show, he's getting dramatic about it. Because they had like a reenactment of it, and then they would cut to the historian, and he's like, and now you got to ask yourself, how long does it take to kill 70,000 men with hand-to-hand combat using only swords and spears? How long could that take? And the answer seems to be about 6 hours. Just ends it so casually, and it always made me laugh. Just the way he builds up this drama, this dramatic way of asking the question, and then just, it seems about 6 hours. Anyway, there were, Paulus does die. Varro makes it out, and he goes back to Rome in shame, tries to lie and say excuses, but there are soldiers that make it out, and they tell what happened. They're actually dishonored so much in Rome. They are outcasts forever. All the veterans of this battle are just looked at like they were evil, not evil themselves, but like an evil spirit, almost no, you got to stay away from the army. No, we don't want you in this battle. But in those, they had centurions, they had commanders, sub-commanders under the consul, who were themselves former consuls and senators and this and that. And at the time, you wore rings of your offices. That was kind of to show that you had served, that you were elected to these things. What you did, basically, you would wear the ring. And one of Hannibal's commanders after this battle said to him, "Oh, we got to march on Rome now." But Hannibal knew better. Rome was they didn't have the troops, they didn't have the food, they didn't have the supplies to put Rome under siege and wait it out. Like that, the Carthaginian army would wind up being the ones who wasted away before the Romans. So he didn't. And, that commander, said, "Oh, Hannibal, you know how to win battles, but you don't know how to use them." Something like that. But there was no way he was going to do that. But he did want to get more troops. So he sent his brother Mago to Carthage to go ask them for supplies. And they were kind of mad at him because Rome was harassing all the other colonies. Where Rome couldn't beat Hannibal, they were kind of going all over the place trying to just get Carthage to make him stop. So, they were mad. And so when Mago came and got to Carthage, got to their council, he went there and they're, yelling at him, this and that, what has your brother done now? Blah, 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 this, that. And he just takes a bag that he had with him and just empties it out on the floor in the middle of this chamber, the meeting chamber. And it's all the rings of office from all those they killed from the Trebia, Trasimi, and now Cannae. And it's just such a huge moment in the history of it where it's just so dramatic, where he just walks in, he's getting yelled at, and he just dumps out this bag. And Carthaginians didn't really send much still, which is it's a fun thought experiment to think about. What if they did back Hannibal 100% of the way? There was also a opposition party. There's always opposition in politics. So the opposition party was the one that was in power and didn't want to help Hannibal because they didn't want Hannibal to get that honor. Stupid as it is, but it's a fun thought experiment. So what if they actually sent him everything he needed to lay siege to Rome, and actually what the world would be like without it? But yeah, they never offered Hannibal battle in Italy again after that. They kind of went back to what he was doing, trying to take all these cities and towns and stuff and convert them away from Rome. And that was really his last success, because he couldn't really get anybody to flip on Rome. And if he did, again, the Rome would just send a small army to that village and say, "Hey, you sure you want to do that now that he's all the way down in the south? You city up in the north of Italy," or vice versa. He just never could get. He didn't have. Eventually, he did. He realized that he needed another army. So he called his brother Hasdrubal, who was commanding in Spain in his absence, and he said, "Hey, Hasdrubal, bring this army over." And that Scipio that we talked about, his son or his grandson, I could be wrong. I believe it's his son. I believe this grandfather was in the First Punic War, but the next in line of the Scipios, who later becomes known as Africanus, Scipio Africanus. He was another Hannibal. He was another Alexander. He was a great commander, one of the best. And he wiped out that army that Hasdrubal was bringing up to help his brother Hannibal. Beat them in battle, wiped them out, sent Hasdrubal's head to Hannibal as like a like, "Hey, this is what we did to the army. You're not getting any help." So eventually, Scipio gets an army. The Senate votes to give him to, call up more troops, levy more troops, and they sent the army to Carthage itself. He actually took those veterans from the Battle of Cannae, it's like 10 years later. That's how long he was in Italy to be in that battle. It's like a redemption because he knew that they would do anything to remove the disgrace that they put upon themselves. So they did that, and Carthage called back Hannibal. Said, "No, you have to come. You have to defend the city. This is our homeland. You have to come, leave Italy, and protect the city." So he goes back with Mago, and it comes to Battle of Zama, where it's where Hannibal ultimately loses. He survives, but at the Battle of Zama, now they're back in Africa, so Hannibal had a fresh batch of war elephants to use. But at that point, the Romans had fought elephants throughout the times. There was Pyrrhus of Epirus who came over with elephants. They fought the Carthaginians in the First Punic War's elephant. So they kind of, they knew how to deal with them. And that's what Scipio commanded them to do. When, they start out with a charge of the elephants to break that line of the army. And he just said, just step aside, just create lanes for them. Because, yeah, the animal is commanded to charge and to charge straight through everything. But if there's nothing there, it's not like the animal's going to, the elephant's going to say, "Oh, no, we got to turn." Like, no, it's just going to keep going. That's what they did. They stabbed it along the way, and they shot bows at the guy who's on top, who's riding the elephants and all that. And so elephants were pretty much a non-factor in that. And Hannibal lost that battle to Scipio. And then he was pretty much in exile from Carthage the rest of his life. He wound up working with Macedonians because at the same time, he kind of made an alliance with the Macedonian king. This is way after Alexander. Macedon is not an empire or anything like that. So to attack Rome. So there was actually the Second Punic War and the Macedonian War going on at the same time with Rome. And so, eventually he went to Macedon to try to help him. Macedonians couldn't stand up. The hoplite tactics were way past their prime. And that's what the Greeks and the Macedonians fought with. And eventually, Hannibal was in the court of some Hellenistic king or something like that. I don't remember exactly, but in Turkey. At that time, it was still it was Greek from the time that Alexander had conquered it. And Scipio actually wound up going there and they actually had dinner together, which is a little twist of irony. And Scipio asked him, "Well, who do you think are the best commanders, best generals in history?" And Hannibal not wanting to give him the satisfaction, he said, "Well, I'd put Alexander first," which Scipio can argue with. Alexander is Alexander the Great for a reason. And then he put Pyrrhus of Epirus, who invaded Italy. So he never lost against Rome, which is true. That's actually the term today is Pyrrhic or Pyrrhic victory. Comes from Pyrrhus, to where he won every battle, but he was just taking such losses that it was like a loss in itself. And eventually he just left. Supposedly, actually, he was in Sicily, and as he's leaving, he said, what a marvelous battlefield we leave for the Romans and Carthaginians, like he's a prophet of some kind. But so ancient history, you got to believe these, whatever it is, you got to believe it. And eventually, yeah. So then gets to the third, and he says, "Me." Hannibal says, "I'm the third best." And now Scipio looks at him. "What do you mean? How could you say that? I beat you." And he goes, "Well, I'm the best, or I'm the third best." Scipio then Said, all right, well, where would you put yourself if you beat me? And then Hannibal kind of has to admit, he said, yeah, then I would put myself over Alexander. Kind of acknowledging that Scipio is a great commander. And yeah, eventually, the Romans always had a bounty on him. Yeah. He was the great terror of Rome forever. Even after he was exiled, after all that, even after he was dead, they would talk about him. Nobody went into Italy and marched around like that. So, eventually they tracked him down, and he wound up trying to escape, but the Romans cut off all these escape routes in this palace that he was in, and he had a ring that was filled with poison, and he drank that, and that's how he went out. But yeah, so because of that time period and all of that, I picked Mago for his name. My pup. Where is he? Come here, Mago. Come, come. Oh my God, you ate all of that. Come here. Come on. Come here. Oh, do it all day, but now you don't want to do it. Come here. All right. Well, that's episode 3, everybody.